All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the social studies specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, our special guest is Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, who's here to do a little bit of listening and learning with the Secretary of State to talk about what his job entails, probably in two phases. What did that job entail in a normal day, and possibly what does that job entail now in today's world? And then the Secretary has definitely said that he would like to take questions as well. So with that, Secretary, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll try to keep the introduction brief. I think most of our educators have a generally pretty decent idea of what government does, so I won't go into a heroic, detailed compendium of my personal accomplishments or my daily work ethic. The Secretary of State's office is in the Constitution. That's why it's called the Constitutional Office, created in 1820 to keep the records of the legislature and of the governor. Record keeping has taken on many different shapes over the years, adding on things like corporate filings, tabulations of elections, registrations of motor vehicles, and then circling back to the original premise, and the state archives was created in 1965. So we have about 440 employees, makes us one of the largest departments of this kind in the country, because I'm one of three secretaries of state that does in fact have oversight of motor vehicles. Most motor vehicle offices are standalone agencies or parts of departments of public safety, transportation, et cetera. We have a lot of public interaction. We say that we touch about 1 million people a day. Sometimes we find ourselves touching them with something of a fist. We issue about 1 million driver's licenses. We suspend about 85,000 licenses a year. We register about 1.5 million motor vehicles. We supervise all county, state, and federal elections and primaries. We write referendum questions. We supervise and qualify 27,000 notaries public, file about 80,000 corporate entities. In the archives, we host about 100 million permanent records going back to 1639, and about another 200 million non-permanent records that are on some type of statutory destruct schedule. Along that line, I'm the acting chair of the Board of Directors of the Information Resource of Maine. I'm the chair of the Regulatory Fairness Board. We host the Address Confidentiality Program for victims of domestic violence in our offices. There's almost nothing we don't interact with at some time or another, and that's the normal course of business. Of course, now with the coronavirus, our role has gotten a little bit more expansive and also retracted at the same time. We shut down our motor vehicle offices 3 weeks ago today. As of last week, we had about 12,000 rapid renewal applications waiting in the mailroom to be acknowledged and have envelopes stuffed. We generate about $140 million worth of revenue. So we're an affirmative revenue generator for the state. About $105 million of that is highway fund. The rest is general fund, mostly corporate filings and business filings around UCC liens and that sort of thing. So this is a different time right now, as you all experienced. We were talking about the coronavirus as early as late January. I was in Washington, D.C., and we were kind of scratching our heads seeing it spread to Europe, wondering when it was going to be declared a pandemic, never imagining how hard it was going to hit the state of Maine. You know, and I went to the credit union today to deposit a check, and I said to the teller, I said, you know, ordinarily it's considered inadvisable to walk into a bank with sunglasses and a mask, but now that's kind of the new reality. So, in terms of our work, we interact a lot with kids. We have our kids page online. All of you should be familiar with that. We've been emphasizing that now in my relatively new and temporary role as chair of the state's Complete Count Committee for the census. We do kids programs around 8th grade citizenship, the parent-student mock election, the Native American history and essay, the history and culture essay contest, and the Constitution poster and essay contest, which are both pretty popular. The Native American waxes and wanes depending on teacher energy. We understand we throw a lot at teachers who have a very short time frame to develop curriculum for the coming school year, but we try to be a resource as best as we can. I have been to many schools to answer questions about how government works, how it functions, what my role is, doing a lot of exercises around parliamentary law, mock government, talking with student councils and kids who are interested in careers in government or in learning more about how government entities work and interact with the public. So those are some of the things that we try to provide. I don't have a typical day, so from there I think it's probably reasonable to see what questions you might have about resources we can provide, or any questions you might have about what we do.
Thank you, Secretary. For those of you who are maybe half looking into the chat room, and I think, Secretary, I think you know that we had Nicole Ladner on, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that she did a webinar for us about the kids page and all the activities and stuff that you guys provide.
Yep.
So if anybody in this chat is not familiar with that, I gave you the link. I encourage you to take a look at that. There is a lot more out there than you would think. And you heard the Secretary talk about all of the, wow, dozens, hundreds of things that you are involved with?
Yeah. Yeah, it never ends. Other duties as may be assigned, and they assign it all.
I'll start with a kind of a question to kind of guide the group just a little bit. You had said, I think that something along the lines of, I think most people have some general understandings of how the government works. I'm wondering, I'm looking at the audience here, knowing the ones that I know, I think we're pretty heavy into like upper elementary into middle school with a couple of high schools sprinkled in as well. What would you say, like if you were working, let's say 3rd grade, 7th grade and high school, what would you, if you were visiting those type of classrooms, what would you share with the kids? What would be the focus?
Well, the thing and that's actually an ideal age range, because that's when kids are really open and interested in this sort of thing. They may be learning it for the first time. They're often most interested in history at this age, and they're interested in splashy events, like the Revolution, the Civil War. What I try to focus on in those discussions is why government is relevant to them, because that's the first thing I think that they will shrug away. Is like, this doesn't mean anything to me. When you start talking about how a bill becomes a law, and I don't care what group you're talking about. If you're talking about college students, graduate students, or civic organizations, if I put together a slideshow about how a bill becomes a law and ran through, like, say, the 10 steps from introduction to reference to public hearing to work session to first reading, second reading, third reading, engrossment to enactment, you have to have superhuman capacity to not fall asleep in that, because it's not meaningful to most people. So what I always try to do when I discuss this is find some touch point that makes it relevant. Give you an example, a real life example actually. We do, in our work at motor vehicles, we oversee the driver education schools. And obviously this is far more relevant to kids that are sophomores and juniors in high school than they are to middle school kids, because that's when they're starting to take driver ed. And in driver education, we always had a professional development organization that had a little bit of a schism, and there was a group that thought they should be more politically active. And so they split off and created a group of their own. And then they went before the legislature, and they were agitating to have some pretty serious changes made to the driver education laws. So, and they had a lot of success, and a lot of it happened when I was out of office. For those of you who have, followed the switches and changes in government, the Secretary of State is also one of the few secretaries that's elected by the legislature. New Hampshire and Tennessee are the other two that do it that way. Most are elected statewide. About 7 are appointed by governors. So it's all different. But because of that particular change, I was politely but rather firmly shown the door at one juncture for a couple of years, and then they brought me back. And in the meantime, you had this change in driver education where they doubled the number of practice hours that a student had to have, and added 50% to the amount of time that students could not have passengers, and other, rather strict changes. So in the meantime, I'm asked to go speak to the original group of driver educators, and they wanted to know how they could also participate in this process. And I'll tell you, as I described the process of public hearings and legislative action, these are people who were sitting on the edges of their seats, and they did, their hands kept coming up because they wanted to ask questions like, how do we get involved? Who do we talk to about getting notices of public hearings? And I've never forgotten that. And one of the things I always try to take to middle school kids especially is bring them something that's real and something that's relevant to them. And that might be, something as historic as how we got the motto, vacation land. That was something that was done by the legislature. How the University of Maine got its name, that was done by the legislature. But finding specific touch points, either in current events or in something that we've done before, that I can point to, this is what they did and how people participated in it. That it's not done by other people, it's done by people like them. There's an old saying that the world's problems don't wait for perfect people to come along before they're solved. It's whoever you got in front of you. And we incorporated a lot of that narrative in our sesquicentennial program of the Civil War. Who these heroic officers and soldiers were. These were regular people who otherwise were leading unremarkable lives until the war broke out and they were thrust into these rarefied positions where nobody could make the decision for them. They had to do it themselves. And I think we find a lot of success grasping the imaginations of these kids when we're talking about government in that type of context that's real to them. So that's what we try to do. And I do a lot of in-person classroom visits. And for those of you who wonder about that, I've got 1 year left, or actually about 10 months or 9 months and counting. But this spring I've gone up to the middle school at St. Agathe. I've gone to the Range 3 Elementary School down in Topsfield. I have been to the Vassalboro Community School. I will go pretty much anywhere, because there the most important message isn't really the content. It's that they are important enough for the Secretary of State to come to their school. So that's always a resource for you.
Secretary, I'm slightly confused. You said people find the whole process of how a bill becomes a law boring. As a social studies specialist, that seems very odd that that's not on the top of people's agendas. But I will defer to the rest of the group if they have any questions since my social studies standards revisions went through that process last year. I got to be very familiar with the APA process and making sure that your office was aware for all of our public notices. But maybe that's just me. I'm the only one who enjoys that.
Well, there are some people I find enraptured by the idea of tax returns and accounting too, by the way. So it's whatever grabs your attention, I suppose.
Does anybody here, you should have the ability to unmute yourself. I don't see anything in the chat box. Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask Secretary Dunlap?
Hi, Secretary Dunlap. My question is, you mentioned a few kind of facts, like, one of 3 Secretary of States elected by legislature, one of the largest departments in the country for Secretary of State. And I was just curious if there's any other kind of little fun facts that's kind of nice to give kids about what makes Maine state government a little unique.
Well, I mean, we're the only state that elects all of its constitutional officers by ballot of the legislature. The nature of these constitutional offices has changed rather dramatically over the last 200 years. For instance, the adjutant general, who is now appointed by the governor, was elected by the legislature until about sometime around 1875. So during the Civil War, arguably one of the most important public positions in Maine was elected by the legislature. John Hodgson was elected 3 times by the legislature to serve as adjutant general. Also, the state land agent. The state land agent, when we became a state in 1820, the state possessed a fair amount of what they called wild land. It was not owned by anybody. It was within state borders. There is actually a cash payment to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, compensating Massachusetts for the loss of that wild land when we became a state. And the land agent's job was to put the land into production. And this is one of the stories that we tell about what we call accidental history. So you follow the controversies in the paper, like I do, and every once in a while they'll have this eruption of controversy around panhandlers and the medians with cardboard signs, which turns out is nothing new. And there was a problem with panhandlers in urban areas in the 1830s, and then someone discovered, somewhat to their horror, that a lot of these elderly beggars were actually veterans of the American Revolution who had been promised grants of land by the Commonwealth in exchange for their military service. The problem in the Revolution was that there were no records kept. They didn't have muster rolls. They didn't have monthly returns. All the documents that we have, for instance, from the Civil War, which we have for a reason, which I'll get into if you're interested. But the legislature sort of went to work on this and came up with a mechanism whereby if you were a veteran of the Revolution or a widow of a veteran of the Revolution, you could make application for a grant of land, and anywhere from 200 to 1,000 acres, depending on your rank. If you're a commissioned officer, you get 1,000 acres. If you're a foot soldier, you get 200 acres. And the idea wasn't that you'd have somebody with absolutely no means going way up into the North Woods to clear 200 acres of land for a farm, but rather that they could sell it. They could sell that grant of land and have some money for their dotage. It was very successful, but in order to qualify, you had to go to a magistrate and swear out an affidavit on a pre-printed form as to what you did in the Revolution. And we have all those affidavits in the archives, and they constitute our only written record of what Maine residents did in the American Revolution. And some of it is really, quite frankly, shocking what people went through during the Revolution. We have vague familiarity with the hardships at Valley Forge, but we have a letter from a fellow who was from Oxford County, the town of Hebron, and he had been in the Navy and was captured 3 times, and they finally put him on a prison hulk in the Thames River, and he wrote about surviving on rats and moldy bread, and his teeth fell out from scurvy, and now here he was, rather humble, decades later, and he concluded his affidavit with the phrase that I find myself standing in need of assistance from my country. Quite moving stuff. These are some of the records that we have and that we try to present in that sort of context. Like you have the controversy around beggars, and is that something new? I mentioned the records from the Civil War, very, very high level. We have the most complete collection of records from the Civil War of any state in the country, because John Hodgson, who was elected by the legislature, in 1859, the horrific discovery was made that not the Secretary of State, but the state treasurer had used state funds to back his own investments, which had gone quite badly, and he'd lost an amount of money equivalent to 1/4 of the state budget. When the auditors came to the Treasury, they were a little bit shocked to find that we were short of about $100,000, and so no invoice was honored that was not backed up with good records. The Attorney General was appointed by the governor until the 1840s, and then the legislature amended the Constitution to have the Attorney General elected by the legislature as well. So there's been a lot of changes, and it is rather unique in the trajectory of the country. You know, here we are in the bicentennial year, and in the bicentennial year, because there were votes on separation from Massachusetts as early as the 1790s, which all were thwarted by the federal passage of the Coasting Act, which stipulated that a ship carrying any amount of freight down the coast of the United States would have to stop in a port in every state along the way and pay a duty. And if we separated from Massachusetts, that was going to add, I think, something like 4 or 5 states, because you paid duties to states that you did not border with. So if we were on our own, we'd have to pay as early as Massachusetts. If we were part of Massachusetts, sailors wouldn't have to pay until they got as far south as New Jersey. So very unique history that informs who we are and how we got here. And that's the premise of what we try to present to your students.
Thank you so much.
Secretary, I can let you know that Heather Morin from the State Archives is joining us today. And as you've been referencing some of the materials, she has been sharing the records in the chat box. So if people aren't paying attention to the chat box, thank you, Heather. I was going to start looking it up, but I figured you'd be on top of that. So she shared the link for people to see the Revolutionary War land affidavits.
We will bring groups of students in on, usually it's part of what we do with our Constitution. We'll do that as part of those contests. We'll bring classrooms into the archives. The problem with the archival records is that we really aren't set up for public tours, and so and these are also original records that are completely irreplaceable. So we are very careful to not put them at risk. So we don't usually take that sort of thing to schools. We do have the capacity to make exact duplicates. We have a high resolution camera that we paid about $85,000 for, that we share with the library and the museum. And we make records, copies of records that are so close to the original that we actually have to mark them as copies, so that we don't mix them up. And those are the types of things that we can make available to the public and to school groups, including things like fire tower maps, which teachers have used for things like teaching trigonometry and calculus. They're a 360-degree view of the horizon. These are the maps that were used in fire towers by the Forest Service until we got things like aircraft and radios that made the need for watchers on tops of mountains unnecessary. So, we can provide some resources, but it's not open-ended.
Other questions for the group, from the group for the Secretary?
Well, you certainly have my contact information, so anybody that does have questions can always contact us offline, and we're happy to be a resource however we can be, whether it's stuff around elections or the upcoming fall election and the primary. Certainly we get back into the school year, hopefully we're back in classrooms, or questions about history, or corporate filings even. We can talk about why businesses do the things they have to do. And maybe educate them that way. Whatever your interests are that we can provide, we'll try to assist.
Secretary, there was a question about having you come into classrooms. Is that basically a reach out and contact you, or what is that process?
Just reach out and contact us, either by email. My direct email is matthew.dunlap@maine.gov. Our phone number is 626-8400. We try to schedule it in advance, obviously, so the further out we go, the more easy it is to manage. I don't know what I'm going to be doing next come January. If I have availability after I leave office, I'm always happy to come. If you don't mind having a worn out, irrelevant Secretary of State, former, come to a classroom, I can be available there too as the new secretary, whoever that turns out to be, gets acclimated. It takes a while. It's very much drinking out of a fire hose for the first year or so. But whatever we can do to support, we will do.
Secretary, can I ask, so what's the, so you're saying you've got 10 months left. It's a legislative appointed or legislative voted on position. Is there any sort of semblance to like term limits? You had mentioned that you had been kind of asked to step aside for a while, then came back. What is that process? Because it sounds like you were in, you're out, you're back in, and now it sounds like you're planning to be again.
Yes, we are subject to term limits, and that's why I'm leaving. And the term limits law was enacted in the mid-'90s. When I came to the legislature in '96, mine was the first totally term-limited class. So we were the first legislative session of legislators newly elected who would not know anything but term limits. And constitutional officers and leadership candidates were also included in that. So Dan Gwiatkowski was my predecessor. He served 4 consecutive terms and was termed out, which is what made it possible for me to run. I was elected in December of 2004. It's actually the first thing that the legislature does after they get sworn in. They get, they assemble in the morning, they take the oath of office, they hear the windy speeches, and then they break for lunch and have their pictures taken with their families, and then they come back. And the first order of business is to elect the constitutional officers for those political years. And then they adopt their rules and sundry things and then take off again until the first Wednesday in January when they start doing real work. So because of term limits, I can only serve 4 consecutive terms. I was actually running for my 4th term in 2010 when Governor LePage was elected and the Republicans took control of, I'm a Democrat, by the way, so the Republican Party took majorities in both the House and the Senate, and they elected Charlie Summers as Secretary of State, who served 2 years, ran for U.S. Senate, and lost the general election to Senator King. Charlie and I are still very good friends. It's a weird part of the business that you don't always see, is that you see conflict in the news. You see, this side winning or that side winning. But actually, 90% of what happens is not partisan. And because I believe in this department and its ability to serve the public, so I made a commitment to make sure that Charlie Summers had every tool he needed to succeed in the transition. And when the Democrats took the majority back in 2012, and the rumor was already floating around that they were interested in me being their candidate for Secretary of State if they came back, the first call I got Wednesday morning after the election was from Charlie Summers. And he said, just tell me what you're going to need, and I'll make sure you have it. So there's something to be said for the power of civil government in a democracy. Even with the divisions that we see in our society, people still work together, and they try to disagree without being disagreeable most of the time.
Secretary, thank you for your time today. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the process of how you're notified that you're being considered as a candidate, or how many other people are involved in that process? And then how that
it's truly a shadow process. There is no paperwork. So the process of becoming a candidate for a constitutional officer is as informal as you simply let the clerk of the House know that you're going to be a candidate. Now, one of the vagaries of this is that candidates for constitutional officers, and those are limited to the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the State Treasurer. The State Auditor is elected the same way every 4 years. It is not a constitutional office. It exists in statute. It's called a statutory office. You cannot have a campaign committee. You cannot have a political action committee. You are not allowed to raise money. In fact, if you're talking with a leadership team who is raising money, or recruiting candidates, when they start talking about fundraising, you have to leave the room. You can't be there for it. So it's really, like I say, when I say it's a shadow campaign, I'm not kidding. I mean, you're elected by legislators. So when I first ran, I was working nights as a bar manager at the original Pat's Pizza in Orono, and I was working basically to raise, I take money from tips, and I'd use it to pay for gas so I could drive to, Oxford County and talk to candidates about my candidacy. And you just put it out there that way. And then the actual process is before the joint convention, you have a joint caucus. The Republicans have one and the Democrats have one. It's House members and senators together. And you ask people to nominate you to be the nominee. You have a nominator and a second. And just chemically, you always like to have a senator and a House member, a man and a woman from the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. So it's a limited pool of people you want to nominate you, just to show that you are representing a broad array of the state, a broad spectrum of the state. And then you're nominated in the caucus. It's a secret ballot. These are about the only secret ballots that legislators get, by the way, is the ballots for leadership and constitutional officers. So you're nominated in the joint caucus, and then the next day is when the joint convention is, and you go through a similar exercise where you are nominated. Your name is placed in nomination. There's, like I say, there's no paperwork. You don't have to file any documents the way you do when you run for the legislature, where you file nominating papers and candidate consent and that sort of thing. It's very informal, and it's a secret ballot. I'll tell you a war story if you're interested. When I first ran, it was very close. We had, I think it was a 1-seat majority in the Senate and a 1-seat majority in the House. And my opponent was former Congressman Dave Emery. And in 8 years in the legislature, apparently I'd made a few enemies, which happens, and we had a new sergeant at arms for the Senate. And the way it works is that, you take your places, all the House members sit in their seats, and the senators array themselves in the front, and they hand out ballots. And the ballots, had my name and Congressman Emery's name on them. And then once everybody has a ballot, you're instructed to mark your ballot. And what was supposed to happen was that they would call the members forward to the well of the House alphabetically or by row, calling them in by row. And the new sergeant at arms didn't know that, and he went around and collected ballots from members, and he put them in the ballot box. And the Secretary of the Senate saw this. As they get ready to call people down front, they check the ballot box, they find a pile of ballots in it. And she said, "Where'd these come from?" And the sergeant at arms says, "Well, I was collecting them." It's like, "Oh, no. We have to check people's names off." So they had to spoil the election and start over again. And it took time because they had to go print more ballots. Well, in the meantime, there were 2 Republicans that had to leave, including one who was a law enforcement officer and had to go pull his shift. So these 2 Republicans left, and they redo the election. And when they tallied it up, I had won by 1 vote. So 1 Democrat voted against me, 1 left a blank ballot, and the 2 Republicans left, leaving me ahead by a net of 1 vote. So lots of machinations happen in these secret elections. And of course, you don't know. Some deals were made, but apparently they fell through. So like I say, it's a shadow process, but it certainly has its own level of intrigue.
Thank you, Secretary.
What other questions do you have for the Secretary? What questions do you have?
Secretary Dunlap, this is Bree Callan. I teach World Governments and AP US Government at Mount Ararat and Topsom. And I remember seeing you so much in the film Dawnland, and I've gone to a couple of trainings. What is something that has been impactful to you as a person having this position in Maine government?
Well, there's no end of it. You mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, you get some really strange opportunities. It's more than just being the chief motor vehicle officer and being asked to administer road tests to someone who's terrified of somebody in a uniform. I've done a lot of that. Obviously, you know, I was asked to be on the TRC by a person in my community who was a teacher at the university. And knowing, you know, the rather strained relations between the tribes and the state, I said, well, you know, not so fast, because I've seen a lot of great ideas come out of Augusta designed to save the tribes. Let me talk to some folks over in the Penobscot Nation before I agree to do it. And they were very enthused. They said, oh yeah, this is a very important thing. When I interviewed, you know, having no background in child welfare or human services, I mean, I chaired the Fish and Wildlife Committee in the legislature, and I was Secretary of State with motor vehicles, you know. I said, if you're talking to me, it must be pretty lonely at the bottom of the barrel. But and actually all 5 of us that were on the commission said the same thing in our first conference call, that I never thought I'd be picked. They did a good job. We worked really, really well together. Our report was a bit of a watershed. It's the film. We were not crazy about the film. When we were approached by the convening group about having a documentary film crew follow us around, we're like, are you kidding? I mean, this is going to be wrenching and hard enough as it is without people with cameras everywhere. But they were tremendous. They were very respectful. If people did not want to be filmed, they didn't have to be filmed. And now, in the wake of it all, the film Dawnland may be the most important thing that came out of that process. It's won an Emmy Award. It's been seen probably by a couple of million people. And we just never realized, I mean, just what that legacy of that film was going to be, and the process. It's really carried on the process around the country. And likewise, some of the other things I've been able to be a part of, like the Russian American Rule of Law Consortium Steering Committee. And I went to Russia 20 years ago as part of an exchange with some other legislators, including the brother of former U.S. Senator Heidi Heitkamp. He was my roommate. And having the opportunity, you talk about world studies and world government, you know, I grew up in an era when, you know, the Russians were our enemies. They were these sort of short, fat people with headscarves that wanted to conquer the world, right? They're grim. They were not, and when we went over to Russia, and these incredibly kind, happy people were so proud of their families, they're so proud of their businesses, what they were doing. After about a week, Joel said to me, he said, how do you feel now about all those billions of dollars that we spent over the last few decades pointing missiles at these nice people? I've been to China, I've been to Taiwan, I've been to Israel and Germany. And as somebody who was a bar manager, you know, I've been to probably something like 38 or 40 states. These are opportunities that you don't get any other way. And, you know, certainly for those school groups or those teachers who are interested in having me talk about my experience, say on the Presidential Election Integrity Commission, which was very controversial and got me on PBS NewsHour more than once. You know, talking about those processes, how they run an election in Taiwan. You know, what is the process for someone to take out a loan in a country like Russia, you know, where they don't really have banks the way we understand banks to be. I try to be that resource if an educator wants it. Shocking to me, very few ever take me up on it. I have not spoken. I've only been to Old Town High School, which is literally, I can see it from my house, probably 3 times, and not at all since probably 2016. University of Maine, I've been there 2 or 3 times. Usually Amy Freed will have me come talk to one of her grad classes. But very few take me up on it. But when we do, it's always a great experience. So that's why I'm so happy to make the offer. It's not like I'm having a hard time squeezing these things into my schedule. The first rule of operation in this office is that the world stops for kids. And I have hosted school groups at the State House and the archives, you know, try to make it for them as much as I can.
Thank you.
We're at about 1:45, so I've got a couple more minutes. This would be your last call. Any questions that you might have for the secretary?
Secretary, I was just curious to hear more on the election integrity committee that you were part of. If you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, very similar to the TRC. It was a sort of a casual inquiry. And I'm a former president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and you have professional organizations like this one. I mean, here we are talking with educators through the Department of Education. And, I never really dabbled too much in the National Conference of State Legislatures or Council of State Governments because I worked as well as being in the legislature, and I never had time to get involved. I think I went to one conference after 9/11 when we had questions about insurance, and I wanted to learn more about it, and I got to go to a conference. NAS is not like that. NAS, there's 47 secretaries of state. Alaska, Utah, and Hawaii have lieutenant governors that fulfill the same functions, and a lot of lieutenant governors come to our meetings. And we get to know each other. We get to know each other really well, and we have 2 meetings a year. We've hosted the national conference 3 times since '93, all usually in Portland. The old port, lobsters. How can you go wrong? And Secretary Kobach from Kansas, now former Secretary Kobach, something of an electric figure in American politics. He has very strident ideas about elections, and while I don't agree with him on almost anything politically, he and I get along pretty well, and, I helped arrange for a vacation for his family when they were here in Maine and that sort of thing. So he called me in March, about a month after our winter meetings, and he said, hey, it looks like President Trump is going to actually put together a commission to investigate what happened in the 2016 election, because he made these claims about 3 to 5 million illegal votes being cast, and they wanted to get some documentation and substantiation about all that. And I said to Secretary Kobach, I said, Chris, I'm really not looking for extra work, but, let me kick it around. And at length, I finally agreed to be a part of it. He really, they were after me for some reason. Looking back on it, I think they looked at me as somebody who's not a lawyer, elected by the legislature, small state, and I've worked on being nonpartisan in my work. So they thought, oh, this guy's, he's not a firebrand. He won't give us any trouble. And of course, when I was named to the commission, it was unbelievable. The media conflagration. I mean, I couldn't get out of my house for 2 hours the day it was announced because I kept getting calls from like ABC News, the Washington Post, CNN, etc. And then that was followed by thousands upon thousands of emails, postcards, phone calls from people all over the country demanding that I resign, that I not be a part of the commission. And I justified my existence there by saying, look, we do a really good job in elections in Maine, and we have a chance to tell that story and maybe finally put some of these allegations about widespread voter fraud to rest, just based on what we do. And if something happens odd with this, I mean, I've got a bullhorn in my hands, right? Never understanding what I was actually getting myself into. And I won't go through the whole narrative, but we had a couple of meetings that were pretty contentious, and then all of a sudden the information flow just stopped. And I had a couple of reporters who would check in with me, what's going on with the commission? I was like, well, I haven't heard, and they said, well, there's stuff coming out in the media. I mean, and you don't know what's going on? I said, well, they haven't told me. And well, are you asking? I said, well, yeah, I call, I get, a full voicemail inbox, or I send an email, and we have a response to, and I figured they're busy. So a couple of things happened all at once, including the researcher for the group was arrested in Maryland on charges of possession of child pornography, which is something they apparently frown on in the state of Maryland. And to this day, I don't know whatever became of them. They never told us. And then, there was a group in Minnesota saying that they were had been invited to present information to the commission at their next meeting in December, which was the first word I'd had of a December meeting. And I sent a fairly strongly worded letter to the commission saying, hey, what are we working on here? Who are we talking to? What's our schedule? Because I'm not hearing anything. And that's when it got really weird. I got a Facebook message from somebody I knew in Washington who was very well placed and said, can you give me a call? And on my cell phone. So I called and said, look, I got a message from you from a chief of staff of a senator that doesn't want to be named. And the question is, do you have a lawyer? I said, do I have a lawyer? It's like, yeah, you can't take on the White House and the Department of Justice unless you have a legal team. You need to get yourself some lawyers. And that was actually the only time I ever felt actually a sense of fear, like what have I gotten myself into? And I was given the name of a law firm in DC, and I called it, and that was the union between American Oversight and Patterson Belknap, and we filed the lawsuit. And I thought, well, we'll file the lawsuit, they'll know I'm serious. And then the name calling started. And, one of the other commission members said that Matt Dunlap was the fresh new face of victim and fragility culture in America. I was now told by the other side that I should resign. Ultimately, the federal judge ruled in our favor. And when they did so, we had a conference call, and I kind of openly speculated as to whether or not the president was going to dissolve the commission now rather than hand over documents. And that's exactly what happened. I didn't do anything heroic. People sometimes, I've been stopped in airports all over the country. Are you Matt Dunlap? And I just asked for the schedule is all I did. So government works in a lot of different ways, and sometimes just not straying away from things that you think are important without me. I wasn't trying to do anything extraordinary. I was literally just trying to participate. And they weren't ready for that, apparently, which is unfortunate because those allegations are going to continue to have currency, that there's widespread voter fraud, even though any of us who work in elections know that that's not true. So.
That's a great lesson. Thank you.
Secretary, I know that your website has a ton of great information about ranked choice, but I will say that in my national networks this past year, I had a number of colleagues reach out and say, can you tell me more about ranked choice? What exactly is this? So what would you say if you were giving like that short elevator speech to kids and understanding, and I would say probably less of the how it works, but why? Why is this move an important move?
Well, I'll just give you the punchline. Because after we did this, and it was quite a narrative as you followed along. We actually lost count of the number of lawsuits that were being filed back and forth on it, and we didn't know for sure what we were doing until we had about 100 days to construct a completely new system of electing public officials. But the payoff for me was at the end, when I would run into people in the grocery store, and these are people who didn't follow it. And they said, what I like about this is that I can vote for somebody I like without electing somebody I hate. And that was the original premise of ranked choice voting, eliminating the so-called spoiler effect, where, and when I was chair of the redistricting commission back in 2003, and the Green Party was actually openly working in collusion with the Republican Party, because the Republicans would help them recruit candidates and get them qualified in areas that were very tough for Republicans to get elected. And the theory was, if you had a Green Party candidate on the ballot, that they would split progressive votes with Democrats, and the Republican could float up through the middle and win the election. And we've seen enough elections, especially statewide elections, going back to when Angus King was first elected governor, for example. He was elected governor with about 36% of the vote. Between Joe Brennan and Susan Collins, who finished behind King, the idea is that you should be able to rank your choices. And if you really like, someone in the instance of the four-way race between Jared Golden, Bruce Poliquin, and Tiffany Bond, and the fellow's name, I think it was Scott Hoare. That was where ranked choice voting really made a difference, is that the people that voted for the two independents were largely casting protest votes. They were only voting for one candidate, but about half of them did rank. And when they ranked overwhelmingly in favor of the Democratic nominee, Jared Golden, and he wound up winning the election. Otherwise, Congressman Poliquin would have stayed in office because of those protest votes and the people that wanted to vote for the independents because they liked the independents. So plurality elections, the winner take all, it's there for a reason. But what I tell people is that the people who actually don't follow this process as political science students, who just vote, really like it. They really like being able to vote for that sort of eccentric third-party candidate that really practically stands absolutely no chance in the election, without fear of really casting a vote for someone they really detest, who just might be more mainstream and a little bit more popular.
Thank you so very much. We just got a couple minutes to the hour. Does anybody have a closing question or a closing thought for the secretary? All right, everybody, I did put in before the last link in the chat box is for your feedback form and survey. If there's not going to be any further questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. Last call.